You ever meet someone who acts like they're wronged, like the world is against them, and everyone just buys it without question? Well, this wasn't one of those stories where people just shrugged and moved on. Something happened that completely flipped the room, and you'll want to stick around to see how it all unfolded. Trust me, by the time the truth came out, no one could ignore it, and the way it all played out might just make you rethink who you trust. So, watch closely, because the receipts don't lie. From the moment Claire joined the small marketing firm, she had this way of drawing attention without seeming like she wanted it. People noticed her, and not always for the work she did. She carried herself with a certain quiet charm that made it easy to forget she was relatively new. And she had a talent for making colleagues feel like they were the ones noticing her, not the other way around. At first, everyone thought she was just shy, polite, and maybe a little reserved. Her emails were courteous, her responses measured, and her tones soft. But behind that soft exterior, there was a sharp eye and an instinct for gauging office politics that surprised even the most experienced team members. No one suspected that she could, and would, manipulate perception when it suited her. Claire's ability to play the victim role subtly was part of what made her seem so endearing. It was the kind of skill that allowed her to avoid accountability while gaining sympathy whenever convenient. She quickly became familiar with the social landscape of the office. The firm was a close-knit environment, the kind where inside jokes, informal lunches, and shared deadlines could easily form alliances or rivalries. Claire seemed to find her way into every circle without forcing her way in. She would nod in meetings at the right moments, laugh at jokes with perfect timing, and casually let slip personal anecdotes that made people think they understood her. To the outside observer, she appeared approachable and empathetic, a colleague you'd want to confide in. Yet beneath that, she meticulously noted every detail about who was responsible for what, who had influence over projects, and who could make or break reputations. Her notebook was filled with observations disguised as casual reminders, deadlines, assignments, and a mental ledger of interactions that would later be critical. Her interactions with the team were layered. On the surface, she was helpful, sharing tips, sending reminders, offering to assist with tasks when workload pressure mounted. But there was always a subtle angle, a way to shift the narrative if something went wrong. If a project failed, Claire could tilt a comment just enough, or recall a detail selectively, to make it seem like she had tried to intervene and no one had listened. People rarely questioned her because she delivered it with such authenticity, as if she were quietly suffering through circumstances beyond her control. It became habitual for others to assume responsibility for mishaps was broader, collective, or just unfortunate, while Claire remained a steady presence, her image untarnished. That reputation, carefully cultivated over weeks and months, would later play a crucial role in how events unfolded. Her ability to present herself as vulnerable or wronged was not accidental, it was a learned skill, refined over time from experiences in previous workplaces and personal relationships. She knew exactly which expressions, words, and silences would trigger concern or protective instincts in colleagues. Even her posture, how she leaned forward or tilted her head during conversations, seemed to communicate attentiveness while masking calculation. In meetings, she could appear flustered by sudden changes or unexpected challenges. Yet beneath that exterior, she analyzed and recorded every reaction. Her charisma was not just innate. It was a combination of intelligence, social awareness, and an almost theatrical sense of timing that allowed her to control perceptions without overt coercion. People often felt empathy before they realized they were being influenced. And by the time they did, it was too late to shift the impression she had created. Claire's interactions with her manager, Laura, were particularly strategic. Laura was known for being fair but meticulous, someone who valued results and accountability. Claire made a concerted effort to appear conscientious while subtly deflecting blame for minor errors. She would send emails highlighting what she had done, often phrased to suggest she had gone above and beyond, or point out how circumstances beyond her control had limited her options. Laura appreciated diligence, and Claire's carefully crafted communications reinforced an image of someone conscientious and reliable, even when details contradicted that perception. By maintaining this balance, Claire avoided scrutiny while steadily reinforcing a narrative of competence and understated struggle. Her relationships with peers were equally deliberate. She developed a network of colleagues who would casually share information with her, believing they were confiding in a friend, unaware that Claire was filing away these details for later use. Some of these relationships were genuine. She valued connection and understood the importance of trust in the workplace. But she also recognized opportunities when loyalty or sympathy could be leveraged. This duality, authentic engagement alongside strategic observation, was what made her particularly adept at managing impressions. People instinctively defended her or included her in decisions because she seemed trustworthy and thoughtful, even when subtle signs suggested otherwise. The victim persona became more prominent during high-pressure projects. Claire would occasionally let a meeting get tense, reacting with visible frustration or concern, drawing attention from others and shifting the group's focus away from her role in any minor misstep. In one particular campaign launch, for instance, a minor oversight in the presentation deck could have reflected poorly on her contributions. Instead of denying responsibility outright, she expressed disappointment and concern in a way that seemed self-aware and remorseful, but she never openly admitted fault. Colleagues, conditioned to see her as cooperative and conscientious, empathized, assuming the error was circumstantial or collective. She walked away with her image intact, and sometimes even enhanced, because people interpreted her vulnerability as evidence of diligence and sincerity. Her private life mirrored some of these skills. Claire was careful in how much she revealed, presenting curated aspects of herself in public spaces and on social media, while concealing details that could compromise her strategic positioning. She understood optics, both in the professional and personal realms, and her ability to manage them gave her a sense of control that others around her did not always perceive. This sense of control extended to conflicts and disagreements. She rarely engaged in confrontations directly, preferring to let situations evolve while she maintained a visible stance of reasonableness. The combination of careful communication, emotional intelligence, and subtle influence allowed her to navigate complex social dynamics without overtly challenging authority or social norms. As weeks turned into months, her reputation grew as someone perpetually thoughtful and considerate, yet slightly misunderstood. Colleagues would often describe her as sensitive or hardworking, unaware of the tactical awareness underlying each interaction. She was careful not to overplay any angle, understanding that subtlety was her strongest asset. People rarely noticed the calculated nature of her empathy or concern, and the occasional vulnerability she displayed reinforced the very image she cultivated. Every interaction, every response, and every subtle gesture contributed to a consistent persona, one that allowed her to position herself advantageously without appearing manipulative. By the time a critical project was underway, a collaborative effort with high-stakes, Claire had fully embedded herself within the office social and professional network. Her ability to present as conscientious, even when challenges arose, and to elicit trust without forcing it, gave her an edge. People assumed her intentions were always aligned with the team's best interest. But as her later revelations would show, the image was a carefully curated balance of truth and omission. Every subtle observation, every carefully timed reaction, and every interpersonal interaction set the stage for what would eventually become undeniable proof, the receipts that exposed the contrast between her performance, her persona, and the reality of the manipulation she had orchestrated. Even at this early stage, the seeds of the eventual fallout were planted. Claire's awareness of how perceptions influenced outcomes, combined with her ability to selectively reveal or conceal details, created an environment where she could control narratives almost imperceptibly. People believed they understood her motives, yet they were only seeing the version of her she allowed them to see. This careful orchestration of reality, played out through everyday interactions, set the tone for the story that would later unfold. A story where patience, observation, and strategic action would culminate in a revelation that left everyone reassessing everything they thought they knew. The tension started to mount when the firm took on a high-profile client whose project had the potential to define everyone's year. It was a collaborative effort that demanded not only creative execution, but precise coordination, deadlines that left little margin for error, and an acute attention to the responsibilities each team member carried. Claire, as usual, positioned herself at the intersection of multiple tasks, always appearing diligent and proactive. At first, the team believed she was stepping in to bridge gaps and support others, but subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Deliverables that she had claimed to have completed on time showed small errors, minor omissions, and discrepancies that were initially dismissed as oversights in a high-pressure environment. The pattern, however, became clearer with each passing week. By the midpoint of the project, murmurs of frustration began circulating quietly among colleagues. People started noticing that certain reports, spreadsheets, or creative materials didn't align with what had been promised in meetings. When confronted, Claire's demeanor was consistent, apologetic, concerned, and seemingly perplexed by the issues. She framed these problems as systemic, as if the delays or errors were due to misunderstandings, miscommunications, or external obstacles rather than any personal oversight. Most people accepted her explanations because the persona she had cultivated over months suggested honesty and conscientiousness. Few questioned her, and even fewer considered that she might be deliberately deflecting blame while subtly shifting attention away from her own mistakes. As the project neared its final stages, the strain intensified. Deadlines grew tighter, client expectations became sharper, and the team's patience thinned. It was during this period that subtle alliances began forming. Colleagues who were starting to notice patterns in Claire's behavior began documenting incidents, cross-checking timelines, and quietly confirming facts. These observations were piecemeal at first, small contradictions that could easily be rationalized, but over time, they coalesced into a pattern too consistent to ignore. The tension was almost palpable. People who had once trusted Claire found themselves questioning whether her helpfulness was genuine or tactical. Meetings that had once been cordial now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny. Her careful timing, once imperceptible, now seemed calculated in hindsight, revealing the difference between perception and reality. The tipping point arrived during a particularly critical client presentation. Claire had volunteered to consolidate final materials, manage key talking points, and coordinate responses to anticipated questions. As she distributed the deck to the team, subtle errors became immediately apparent: data mismatches, misattributed graphics, and missing references. A junior team member, who had been quietly keeping track of earlier discrepancies, flagged one of the errors just moments before the presentation began. Claire's immediate reaction was a mix of visible concern and forced calm, maintaining her image of composure while trying to mitigate the mounting crisis. Yet the timing of these revelations, coupled with prior inconsistencies, meant her credibility was now under scrutiny, not just by peers but by higher management who had been watching the project unfold closely. The climax of the conflict unfolded in a way that no one could have predicted. During the live client presentation, another team member, acting cautiously and discreetly, presented corrected data and supporting documentation. The contrast between Claire's errors and the verified information was glaring. What had initially appeared as minor oversights now looked deliberate, especially given her earlier attempts to frame delays as collective or circumstantial. Colleagues who had once defended her in casual conversations now exchanged wary glances, realizing that the victim narrative had been a consistent strategy rather than a reflection of genuine misfortune. The room, which had previously been confident in the team's unified professionalism, suddenly recognized the discrepancies in Claire's accounts. The immediate aftermath in the office was quiet but charged. Privately, many colleagues confirmed what they had suspected for weeks. Claire's calculated persona, her strategic deflection, and her carefully orchestrated empathy were now under a microscope. Emails and messages she had sent over the course of months were cross-referenced with work outcomes, revealing a pattern of selective reporting and subtle misdirection. Even those who had once been sympathetic were forced to confront the reality. The image Claire had built was not aligned with her actions. People who had unknowingly amplified her narrative now understood the difference between performance and perception. The sense of shock was amplified because her ability to control impressions had been so effective for so long. Management became involved as the discrepancies reached a level where client satisfaction and company reputation were at stake. The CEO and department heads reviewed internal documentation, compared it with final deliverables, and spoke individually with team members. Each conversation revealed more about the scope of Claire's manipulation, though her outward demeanor remained calm, almost impervious, as if nothing untoward had occurred. She responded with measured explanations, citing misunderstandings and miscommunications, leaning on the persona she had perfected to avoid confrontation. But the growing evidence, combined with first-hand accounts from colleagues, left little room for doubt. Even her most loyal defenders began to reconcile the differences between the narrative she projected and the reality documented in records and emails. The key moment, however, came during a staff meeting when the CEO addressed the entire team. It was subtle at first, almost conversational, but the CEO began referencing specific examples, cross-checking responsibilities, timelines, and documented communications. As the discussion unfolded, colleagues began to realize how thoroughly Claire had curated her victim image. The combination of hard evidence and public acknowledgement from the CEO created an undeniable contrast between her perceived persona and her actual actions. There was a ripple effect. Colleagues who had been neutral or slightly skeptical began piecing together what had previously seemed ambiguous. By the time the meeting ended, Claire's carefully constructed narrative had unraveled publicly, with the receipts, emails, documents, timelines clearly contradicting her story. The emotional climax was not just professional but personal. Claire, who had spent months maintaining her strategic facade, now faced a collective awareness of her true behavior. The team's expressions, ranging from disbelief to quiet satisfaction, reflected the gravity of the revelation. For weeks, she had relied on subtle manipulations, selective disclosures, and a cultivated image of empathy to maintain influence. Now, every calculated gesture, every carefully crafted interaction, was rendered transparent by documentation and shared recollections. People were no longer responding to her persona, they were responding to the reality she had tried to obscure. The contrast between perception and evidence was stark, leaving her isolated within the office she had navigated so deftly before. By the end of the week, the repercussions were clear. Claire's ability to influence colleagues had diminished drastically. Her once esteemed position in social and professional hierarchies within the office was undermined. The evidence, or receipts, as the team quietly called them, had revealed a consistent pattern that no explanation could fully reconcile. Colleagues who had admired her attention to detail and empathy were now cautious, maintaining professionalism but wary of her future actions. The tension of the previous months had culminated in an outcome that felt inevitable in retrospect, though it had seemed unpredictable at the moment. Claire's calculated persona had finally met the cumulative weight of documented reality, resulting in a professional and social reckoning that few could have predicted, even in the quiet moments after the project's conclusion. Whispers and subtle acknowledgments of what had transpired persisted. People discussed her behavior without confrontation, sharing their observations with a tone that was factual, yet tinged with relief. The climax was both professional and psychological. The skillful manipulation that had allowed Claire to maintain control for so long had been dismantled by tangible proof and collective awareness. The office, once an arena for her subtle influence, had become a space where transparency and accountability prevailed, and the once untouchable victim was now subject to scrutiny. By the close of this conflict, the stage was set for the final phase, the aftermath. Decisions regarding Claire's role, and the reflection that would follow for both her and her colleagues. The intensity of the climax highlighted the intersection of personal strategy and professional accountability, demonstrating how a persona meticulously maintained over months could unravel in a matter of weeks when evidence aligned with awareness. The story had reached a turning point, one that would define the resolution and reveal the consequences of carefully orchestrated deception in a workplace setting. Once the evidence against Claire had become undeniable, the dynamics of the office shifted dramatically. Colleagues who had previously hesitated to confront her now felt a sense of empowerment, a quiet but resolute determination to protect themselves and the integrity of the team. It wasn't about vengeance in the dramatic sense. It was about balance, accountability, and ensuring that her manipulation could no longer thrive in silence. People began to organize their observations, highlighting inconsistencies and confirming timelines with facts rather than conjecture. This collective awareness acted as a subtle but powerful counterweight to the control Claire had wielded for months. The realization that the office could act in unison, not out of malice but out of clarity, was a turning point. The first step of what became a de facto retribution was methodical. Colleagues collaborated to document the full scope of Claire's behavior. Every email, every project discrepancy, and every instance where her persona conflicted with her actions was compiled into an organized narrative. It was meticulous work, driven not by anger, but by the necessity to preserve truth. The documentation was factual, unemotional, and thorough, designed to remove ambiguity and create a clear picture that left little room for plausible deniability. When management reviewed the compiled evidence, they were able to see, for the first time in a single, cohesive context, the pattern that had previously been fragmented and easily dismissed. Claire's reaction to this growing scrutiny was telling. She maintained her calm exterior, but subtle cues tightened posture. Brief pauses before responses. The faint flicker of frustration in her eyes revealed the internal realization that the narrative she had curated was no longer unassailable. Attempts to deflect, charm, or explain away discrepancies were met with well-prepared documentation and corroborated accounts. The tools she had relied on to maintain her victim persona were rendered ineffective because her colleagues had aligned on facts, creating a framework of accountability that could not be swayed by performative emotion. The resolution was as much about reinstating fairness as it was about addressing the breach of trust. Management held a series of formal meetings, discussing not only Claire's role in recent projects, but also the broader implications of her behavior on team cohesion and company culture. These discussions were conducted professionally, with an emphasis on documentation and observable actions rather than subjective feelings. The impact of Claire's manipulation was undeniable. While she had maintained the outward appearance of competence and empathy, the underlying pattern of selective disclosure and misdirection had compromised both the project and the office's trust. The final decision involved reassigning her responsibilities, implementing stricter oversight, and initiating measures to ensure transparency in collaborative work going forward. The personal dimension of this resolution was subtle but meaningful. Colleagues who had once been caught off guard by Claire's tactics now had a sense of closure. The meticulous assembly of facts and the calm, deliberate approach to presenting them demonstrated that justice in this context wasn't about dramatic confrontation, it was about clarity, truth, and accountability. This approach allowed the team to reclaim confidence in their work environment without creating unnecessary conflict or drama. The narrative that had once been dominated by Claire's perceived vulnerability was supplanted by a collective understanding of reality, and the office's social and professional balance was gradually restored. Reflection on the events that unfolded revealed deeper insights into human behavior and professional dynamics. Claire's ability to manipulate perceptions highlighted how easily appearances can be misinterpreted when people rely solely on surface-level cues. Her success for months wasn't due to brilliance alone, but to the skillful management of impression and the exploitation of assumptions. The eventual exposure of her tactics underscored the importance of vigilance, documentation, and corroboration in professional settings. For her colleagues, the experience reinforced lessons about observation, discernment, and the value of collective awareness when navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. Interestingly, the aftermath also prompted introspection within Claire herself. Stripped of the protective aura she had cultivated, she faced the consequences of her actions in a context that demanded accountability. The subtle power she had exercised over colleagues was replaced by scrutiny and the need to rebuild trust, which required acknowledgement of past missteps and adjustments to behavior. The office's response, measured, professional, and based on evidence rather than emotion, provided a mirror in which Claire could see the disparity between perception and reality. It was a pivotal moment, not just professionally but personally, illustrating how carefully constructed facades can unravel when confronted with truth and consistency. The experience also had long-term effects on the team as a whole. Beyond the immediate correction of responsibilities and clarification of roles, there was a renewed emphasis on transparency, open communication, and verification of information. Team members became more proactive in documenting contributions and verifying details, fostering a culture where collaboration was built on trust, reinforced by evidence. This change was subtle but powerful. It ensured that future instances of manipulation would be more difficult, if not impossible, to execute successfully. The office learned to balance empathy with discernment, preserving collegiality while preventing the kind of unchecked influence that had allowed Claire's persona to dominate for months. For the individual members of the team, there was a sense of personal growth alongside professional correction. Witnessing the full scope of Claire's manipulations and the methodical process of addressing them provided lessons in patience, observation, and strategic response. Colleagues developed a keener sense of situational awareness, recognizing that emotional intelligence alone was insufficient without corroboration and careful attention to facts. The process demonstrated how collective action, when guided by evidence and communication, can correct imbalances of power in professional environments without resorting to pettiness or personal attacks. In the end, the resolution was comprehensive yet understated. Claire's capacity to dominate narratives through subtle performance and strategic empathy was dismantled not with confrontation or drama, but through deliberate, fact-based alignment of observations and evidence. The team regained confidence, credibility, and a sense of collective agency, while Claire faced the tangible consequences of her actions, now clearly documented and acknowledged by management. The story concluded not with sensational spectacle, but with a reaffirmation of fairness, accountability, and the quiet power of truth. The reflection that followed extended beyond the immediate office environment. Colleagues considered how easily narratives can be manipulated in other professional and social contexts, how perception can be shaped, and how important it is to balance empathy with critical observation. The experience underscored the value of careful documentation, measured responses, and the collective validation of facts before forming judgments. It became a case study in how subtle manipulation can unfold over time, how it can be addressed, and how the lessons learned can strengthen both personal and professional resilience. Ultimately, the story served as a reminder that skillful strategy and social maneuvering, while effective temporarily, is no substitute for integrity and transparency. The receipts that had exposed Claire's behavior were not weapons of vengeance but instruments of clarity, illuminating the truth and providing a foundation for fair resolution. The team, once caught in uncertainty and influenced by perception, now had a renewed understanding of how accountability functions in practice. Through methodical observation, factual documentation, and measured confrontation, the office restored balance, demonstrating that truth, patience, and collaboration are more powerful than any carefully constructed facade. By the time the dust settled, the environment was transformed. Colleagues no longer approached interactions with untested assumptions but with informed awareness, maintaining professionalism while exercising discernment. Claire, now fully exposed, had the opportunity to reflect on her choices and the disconnect between her intentions and the consequences of her actions. For the rest of the team, the episode was both cautionary and instructive, reinforcing that transparency, evidence, and collective responsibility are essential in preventing manipulation and ensuring fairness. The resolution, although devoid of theatrics, was profound in its impact. The carefully built illusion had crumbled, replaced by an accountable, observant, and cohesive workplace.